For the past year and a half now, I've been really enjoying this lens right here, the Canon 100-500. I have to say, this is an incredibly sharp lens and super lightweight. It's a very versatile lens. It actually lives on my camera, on my R5C in my camera bag. And I never thought that a lens this versatile and this powerful would be able to just fit in my bag so effortlessly. I always, in the past, would always keep like a 24-70 or a wide prime on my camera for landscape purposes, mainly because that's what I would gravitate towards. And I used to shoot on a Nikon 300, and that would kind of just be for when I really needed to zoom in on stuff. But I find this being used way more. I'm shooting more telephoto lenses with the lens this versatile. After a year and a half of owning this, I decided to add a little bit more power to what I can do with my magnification. I recently shot this image here that I'm really happy with. I shot this with the 100-500 and the 1.4 teleconverter to give me an effective 700 millimeters, but this is actually a pretty significant crop compared to what the actual image was coming through my lens. I've always been really into shooting the moon, and I've always wanted to shoot stuff with this kind of magnification. So that being said, I went ahead and decided to invest in the Canon 800 F11, which I'm going to unbox right now. I have not actually seen this lens yet. I got the Canon Care Pack warranty for it. And the purpose of this video that we're going to dive right into is we're going to do a comparison. This lens, which by the way does not have a variable aperture, it's a fixed aperture lens at f11. You can't stop down to f16 or f whatever. It's only f11. So we're going to test this lens wide open, and then we're going to put the 1.4 extender on this, and so we're going to just stop it down one stop and do a comparison. We're going to just focus on that for this video, just what's sharper, this lens wide open or this lens with the 1.4 times extender. Okay, we'll go ahead and start with the 800 here. I'm going to shoot these images at ISO 1600 so I can get a fast shutter speed, because we want to be as sharp as possible for these tests, even though we're using the stabilizer. Now the 800 millimeter here only has stabilizer on or off. There's no stabilizer mode. What we're going to do, we're just going to find a common frame for both lenses, and we'll get a couple of test shots for each. We're going to set the same frame, or as close as we can to it. We're going to have the exact same settings, so even though we can technically do f10 at 500 or at 700 millimeters with the extender here, I'm going to stop it down to f11, because the point of this video is to just see what's possible without extending the reach of the 800. But I can tell you already, this is going to be really close, the results of this here. Now a quick note, on the stabilizer modes on the 100-500, there's 3 modes. Mode 1 is for when you have a stationary object that's not moving. Mode 2 and 3 is for when you have a moving object, and when you're in mode 2, it'll stabilize the entire time you're looking through the viewfinder. And in mode 3, it'll do the same thing, but only when you're shooting to save battery. Alright, we have the images loaded here into Lightroom, and I picked the best example from each, so we can see the difference. Here's the 800, here's the 100-500. At full screen, it's hard to tell any difference at all. The colors seem to be pretty consistent. Let's actually check the white balance of these 5800. Yeah, so the white balance is the same except for there's a tint. The auto tint on the raw conversion is different on them. Let's go ahead and match those. There, when we set them both to +15, the colors are nearly identical. I don't see more saturation or more contrast on one or the other, really. Let's dive in and let's zoom in on them. This is the 100-500. And let's zoom in 400%. Then here on the right is the 800. 800 has a little bit more detail on the edges here. Just a tiny bit more detail on the edges. But I noticed, now let's zoom out, let's go a little bit closer to 100. Of course, 100% is the most realistic comparison whenever you're editing images, because that's going to be all that matters for printing. Unless you're going to crop it, but you should crop it first before you determine how it's going to look to print. I noticed just a tiny bit more detail on the 100 to 500 in the trees. Whoops. Just the slice, but it's not enough to really care or be apparent. Both lenses have the tiniest amount of chromatic aberration, and this is actually a great stress test for these lenses because we're backlighting these trees. This isn't really a desirable shot. This is by no means like a print-worthy image. This is just a test. Backlighting is notorious for causing fringing and chromatic aberration on lenses, especially when you're shooting wide open. We are shooting wide open on the 800 because that's the only option at F11. And we are a third of a stop down on the 100 to 500. So that could potentially be helping us a little bit. That kind of might counteract any loss of detail from the teleconverter. But I do notice just a little bit more detail on the 100 to 500. But again, it's not enough to be apparent. Now, again, the 800 seems to be just a tiny bit sharper on the edges. But that's not to say the 100 to 500 is not sharp. And actually, I should take it back just a tiny bit. Seems like in the center, the 800 might be a touch sharper at the edge of the mountain, but when it comes to the edge of the frame, there's ever so slight loss of detail on the 800, whereas the 100 to 500 has a little bit more. I can see between the fine branches more on the 100 to 500. But let's go back to the center. Here in the center, the 800 sharper. Absolutely sharper. You can see between the branches much more significantly in the center of the 800 than you can on the 100 to 500. But by the time you get to the edge of the 800, oh, now in second comparison, it almost looks identical on this side here. My honest conclusion after reviewing these images and looking at these results is that these images are nearly identical between these two lenses. There's very small differences, but they're closer than I was expecting. Let's talk about the obvious differences between these lenses. We have a pretty massive price difference. The 100 to 500 is on average $2,600 plus another $500 for the 1.4 times teleconverter. And then we're comparing that to $1,000 for the 800 F11. And we also went ahead and tested the stabilization of both lenses. I was just tapping both of them so you can see the results here and judge for yourself the differences. Stabilization is definitely a little better on the 100 to 500, but they both work. The autofocus, however, much faster on the 100 to 500. This is just an STM lens, but the 100 to 500, it's L series, and even with the 1.4 times teleconverter, the autofocus is still very fast. So when we consider the difference in price, and we consider the similar results, if your main goal is to get maximum reach and you're shooting landscapes and you don't necessarily care about fast autofocus performance or the ability to have different apertures, the 800 might be a good choice. But the 100 to 500 is a very versatile lens. Having that that 1:5 zoom ratio is incredible. It's really versatile. It's almost a walk-around lens in certain situations. You're paying for the extra features, better weather sealing. It's got a rotatable tripod collar. It has adjustable tension on the zoom ring. It's a great lens. So you can kind of use those results to judge for yourself if the 3 times price difference is worth the zoom abilities, the better autofocus, and the better weather sealing.